All right, let's just get right into it. For 72 hours, American fighter jets launching straight from the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln were striking targets all across Iran. Now, if you just glanced at the headlines, you might think, okay, just another round of back-and-forth military action. We've seen this for months. But the military analysts who actually study these patterns are saying something completely different just happened. This wasn't some random escalation. It was an incredibly highly calculated message. And the timing, well, that speaks volumes. These strikes went down just a single day after Iran's supreme leader was laid to rest. So right in the absolute middle of a national mourning period, the United States basically executed a deliberate operation to systematically dismantle critical Iranian infrastructure.
There's a quote that I think just perfectly nails what we're looking at here. Not with words, with bridges collapsing, with a port going dark, with a rail line to China severed overnight. You see, this is not about diplomatic rhetoric anymore, and it's definitely not your typical military posturing. What we are looking at is a profound physical and economic reality. These were highly calculated strikes designed specifically to kick out the very legs the regime is currently standing on. So, here's the roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to break this down into 5 parts. First, we'll look at the new strategic target. Second, severing the sea route. Third, cutting the land bridge. Fourth, the actual anatomy of the strike. And finally, Iran's 3 broken pillars.
All right, moving into Section 1, a new strategic target, shifting from weapons to infrastructure. The old strategy in this conflict was pretty straightforward. It was defined largely by targeting weapons and military bases, things like missile launchers. The problem with that? Well, a destroyed missile launcher is actually pretty easily replaced. But the new strategy decisively shifts focus to critical infrastructure, meaning ports, bridges, rail lines. We're talking about the actual physical backbone that allows the country to move its goods, its fuel, and its military equipment. So why does this matter so much? Because while you can build a new drone in a week, a heavily damaged commercial trade route takes years and literally billions of dollars to rebuild. The economic fallout from that directly hits everyday life. It impacts fuel supplies and the cost of basic goods in Iran, which inflicts some very long-lasting logistical pain. Let's move right into Section 2, severing the sea route, specifically looking at the Chabahar port strike. The really crucial thing to understand here is the dual-use nature of what was actually hit. On the surface, American forces struck a navigation control tower at the Chabahar port. Sounds like an ordinary civilian building, right? Something just used to guide ships safely. But according to investigators, this tower was secretly tracking commercial shipping near the incredibly vital Strait of Hormuz, and then using that exact data to guide missile and drone attacks against those very ships. So by destroying it, a massive threat to global oil trade was suddenly removed. Plus, Chabahar sits right on Iran's southeastern coast, touching the Indian Ocean. It's one of their very few connections to international waters that sits outside the heavily monitored Persian Gulf. So striking this specific port basically took out one of the few reliable, unmonitored trade options Iran actually had left. Now for Section 3, cutting the land bridge, disrupting the rail corridor. If the Chabahar strike was all about severing the sea connection, this move is about isolating Iran by land. American forces struck a vital railway corridor in the northeastern part of the country. And listen, this isn't just some minor commuter line. It connects Tehran to Mashhad, and from there it acts as this massive artery pushing onward to Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and crucially to Russia and China. This specific geography matters immensely. Why? Because this corridor has been functioning as an absolute lifeline. It's the key route allowing Iran to completely bypass Western sanctions, keep their trade moving, and bring in critical military hardware and components from Russia, which is incredibly important right now since Iran's own stockpiles have reportedly been running pretty low. And that brings us to the number 2, which represents the bridges along this rail corridor that were hit. What's truly fascinating here is how Iran actually responded. Normally, the government downplays or just completely denies any damage from strikes like this. But this time, Iranian authorities unusually and very quickly admitted that these 2 bridges had been hit. The damage was just so undeniable that they had to completely suspend passenger rail service between Tehran and Mashhad. This immediate real-world impact meant everyday Iranians lost a heavily used travel route, while at the exact same time, military planners lost a critical resupply channel right when the country is under massive strain. Let's dive into Section 4, Anatomy of the Strike, looking at the coordinated military operation itself. To really grasp why these strikes were so strategically impactful, we have to look past just the targets and appreciate the technical execution of it all. This was definitely not just a single rogue jet slipping past a radar screen. It was a carefully layered, highly synchronized operation crammed into a very tight time window. Step 1 is suppressing enemy air defenses. Specialized aircraft go in first to neutralize surface-to-air missiles. They use these radar homing missiles, which basically means the exact millisecond an Iranian radar operator turns on their system to look for danger, the American missile uses that very radar signal to ride right back down to the source and destroy it. Then, step 2, strike fighters equipped with precision standoff weapons move in to hit well-defended infrastructure from a completely safe distance. Finally, step 3, heavy bombers and naval long-range missiles launched from offshore ships and submarines deliver massive payloads almost simultaneously across a wide area. Pulling that off requires immense rehearsal-level coordination.
Breaking down the capabilities objectively like this lays out a pretty stark reality about the forces on both sides right now. On the U.S. side, we're seeing a layered precision strike that resulted in highly successful infrastructure destruction. On the Iranian side, despite these large-scale ballistic missile barrages aimed at regional military bases, the vast majority were intercepted by modern air defense systems before they ever reached their targets. This wide, glaring gap between their claimed capability and the actual operational outcome highlights a severe technological disadvantage for Iran, which really undermines their attempts to project strength and deter any further strikes.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Iran's 3 broken pillars and the strategic consequences. For years now, analysts have noted that Iran's geopolitical survival, especially their stability under heavy international pressure, basically rested on 3 foundational pillars. And what is truly remarkable about this specific military operation is that all 3 of those pillars were systematically targeted within roughly a 48-hour window. First, their maritime threat and their leverage over the Strait of Hormuz was neutralized by taking out that control tower. Second, their economic bypass, the Chabahar port, was heavily disrupted, stripping away a vital unmonitored trade outlet. And third, their main supply lifeline, the rail corridor to Russia and China, was severed, completely cutting off both commercial trade and military resupply. The U.S. essentially kicked out all 3 legs of the stool at the exact same time.
Because of this intense, simultaneous pressure, Iran's options have narrowed considerably. It leaves their leadership facing an incredibly difficult dilemma. They have option A. They can escalate militarily, but the operational reality we just looked at shows they are technologically outmatched, and escalation risks losing even more of that critical, hard-to-replace infrastructure that literally keeps their country running. Or there's option B. They can shift toward negotiation. However, failing to respond militarily risks signaling weakness to their own public. And remember the timing we discussed at the very beginning of this. Doing this right after the loss of their supreme leader, during a period of very vulnerable transition and uncertainty, well, that carries massive internal political risks. So the strategy behind these 72 hours of strikes wasn't just to cause temporary damage. It was a calculated stress test to see exactly how much pressure a system can absorb before something fundamentally breaks or before something changes. Which leaves us with a huge question for today. Looking at their dismantled infrastructure and their significantly narrowed options, will Iran choose a path of costly, potentially ruinous military escalation, or will they be forced into a difficult, quiet return to the negotiating table? We are definitely going to be watching this closely. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning what you see.